Sergeant Ivanov had marched through mud, snow, and fire. His uniform carried stains of old battles, the smell of smoke and iron embedded in its fibers. He was a man forged in hardship, disciplined and unflinching. Yet on one bitter winter morning, while the sun struggled to pierce through gray clouds, Ivanov felt a new kind of pain, one that seemed to claw from deep inside his abdomen. It was unlike any wound he had known. Not the burn of shrapnel, not the ache of fractured ribs, not even the sting of hunger from weeks on the front. This was different. At first, he dismissed it as something trivial. A soldier doesn't complain about stomach cramps, he told himself. Perhaps it was food gone bad, or an infection from dirty water. But by noon, the pain intensified, sharp enough to make his knees buckle. His comrades noticed his unusual silence and the way sweat dripped from his brow despite the freezing air. Finally, Ivanov allowed himself to be escorted to the military hospital on the edge of the base. Inside, the whitewashed corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. Nurses in crisp uniforms rushed past, their shoes squeaking on the tiled floor. Ivanov stood at the reception desk, one hand pressed against his stomach, his face pale yet stubbornly composed. "What's wrong, Sergeant?" a nurse asked, scanning him quickly. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then spoke the words that felt absurd even to himself. "I think I'm pregnant." The nurse blinked, then gave a nervous laugh, assuming he was delirious from pain. "We'll run some tests," she said cautiously, motioning him to a bed. But the seriousness in his eyes unsettled her. Soldiers often cracked grim jokes, but not like this, not while trembling with real fear. Within an hour, a small team of doctors gathered around him. They questioned him about his symptoms, his medical history, any possible head trauma. Ivanov answered each one with military precision, but the truth remained the same: the pain, the swelling of his abdomen, the strange sense of movement inside. "Impossible," one of the physicians whispered after an initial examination. Yet, science demanded proof. Scans were ordered. Ivanov lay still under the humming machine, staring at the ceiling as if bracing for artillery fire. Then the impossible revealed itself. The monitor flickered, displaying an image no one in the room was ready to accept. A small figure, curved limbs, a faint pulse, a heartbeat. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Doctors stared wide-eyed at the screen. Nurses gasped audibly. One young intern nearly dropped her clipboard. They had all seen ultrasounds before, but never inside the body of a fully grown man. Ivanov turned his head toward the machine, his eyes narrowing at the ghostly outline on the display. His chest rose and fell heavily. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The room itself seemed to tremble under the weight of revelation. This must be a malfunction," stammered one of the older doctors. "Run it again." They did. Twice. 3 times. And each time, the same flicker appeared. A child. Alive. Growing. Rumors spread through the hospital corridors faster than orders in wartime. Nurses whispered behind surgical masks. Soldiers stationed outside exchanged bewildered looks. "The sergeant is carrying a baby," some said mockingly, while others crossed themselves and muttered prayers. The impossible had walked into their lives, wearing military boots and medals. Ivanov, however, did not laugh or pray. He sat silently on the edge of his hospital bed, staring at his calloused hands. Those hands had held rifles, maps, and bloodied bandages. But never the fragile hope of new life. Memories haunted him as he waited for answers that never came. His childhood in a remote village, his mother's lullabies drowned out by the sound of thunder during storms. The promise he once made to her, before leaving for service, that he would return alive. He had kept that promise. And yet here he was, facing something far stranger than death. "Sergeant Ivanov," said the chief physician one evening, entering the room with a file pressed to his chest. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "We don't know how this is possible. Medically, it defies explanation. But the fact remains, there is life inside you. Real, growing, and time is moving quickly." Ivanov looked up, his eyes hard but unreadable. "Then what do you suggest I do, doctor?" The physician hesitated. "We prepare. We monitor you closely. And, when the time comes, we deliver. The word deliver struck Ivanov like a bullet. He had delivered supplies, delivered orders, delivered his men into battle. But this was something else entirely. Nights grew longer in the hospital ward. Ivanov would lie awake, feeling the faintest flutter inside him, like a bird testing its wings within a cage. Sometimes he pressed his palm against his stomach, unwilling to admit even to himself that the sensation filled him with both dread and a strange, reluctant awe. Other soldiers came to see him, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty. "Is it true, comrade?" one whispered, standing at the foot of his bed. "That you're carrying?" Ivanov didn't answer. He only gave a curt nod, sending the visitor away pale and shaken. The medical staff worked tirelessly, documenting every anomaly, writing notes that read more like science fiction than clinical reports. Some speculated about experimental weapons, genetic manipulation, or exposure to unknown substances on the battlefield. Others, in hushed voices, spoke of miracles, or curses. Yet through it all, Ivanov remained calm. A soldier's training teaches endurance. But deep inside, beneath the armor of discipline, questions gnawed at him. Why me? What is this child? Where did it come from? Weeks passed, and his body changed. The impossible became visible. He carried himself with the same rigid posture, but the evidence grew undeniable. Nurses avoided meeting his gaze, as though afraid he might ask them for answers they didn't have. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Ivanov stood by the hospital window, watching lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. He placed a hand on his abdomen, feeling the child stir. For the first time, he whispered aloud, his voice almost breaking. "Who are you?" There was no reply, only another flutter, stronger this time, as if the life inside him was listening. By then, the hospital had transformed into a fortress of silence. No one dared speak openly about the soldier's condition beyond closed doors. And yet, everyone waited, with a mix of fear and anticipation, for the inevitable. The day the unimaginable would arrive. And so the warrior, who had faced death countless times without flinching, prepared for the strangest battle of his life, not against an enemy with rifles and tanks, but against destiny itself. The hospital felt heavier with each passing day, as if the walls themselves were aware that something impossible was about to take place. The doctors had done all they could, monitored Sergeant Ivanov's vital signs, prepared surgical equipment, and whispered among themselves in nervous tones about protocols that didn't exist in any medical textbook. Nurses hurried down corridors with clenched jaws, their eyes darting away when they passed his room, as though looking directly at him might pull them into the mystery he carried. On the morning it began, the sky outside was the color of iron. A storm had been building all night, its thunder rolling like the drums of war. Ivanov awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his body seized by waves of pain so intense they eclipsed even the worst wounds he had endured in combat. He had been shot, burned, and broken, but nothing compared to this. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one sounding more like a plea than a soldier's controlled exhale. The alarms were raised immediately. Doctors rushed to his side, wheeling him into a stark, blindingly lit delivery room. His boots echoed against the linoleum floor as orderlies pushed the stretcher forward, the sound strangely ceremonial, like the footsteps of a soldier heading toward a battlefield he had no choice but to enter. "Hold on, Sergeant," one nurse said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound calm. "You're strong. You've survived worse. You can do this." Ivanov's jaw clenched. He gave no reply, only a guttural grunt, his hands gripping the metal rails of the bed until his knuckles turned white. The room filled with a flurry of motion, surgical masks pulled over faces, instruments laid out on gleaming trays, the hiss of oxygen tanks. Yet despite the routine procedures, every person present knew this was no ordinary birth. The air vibrated with a tension so thick it was almost tangible. The first cries came not from the child, but from Ivanov himself. A raw, primal sound ripped from his throat as the agony surged. The strongest man among them, a decorated soldier who had never wavered in the face of mortar fire, was brought to the edge of collapse. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his hair, his chest rising and falling as if he were running through trenches again. And then, silence. A beat. Another. The doctors froze as the monitors spiked, and something extraordinary happened. A cry broke the silence, sharp and clear. But it wasn't Ivanov's. It was the cry of new life. A newborn's wail, piercing, demanding, alive. The chief physician lifted the child from the impossible birth, his hands trembling as though he were holding a relic instead of a baby. The room went utterly still. Ivanov forced his eyes open despite the exhaustion threatening to drag him into unconsciousness. His gaze locked onto the tiny figure. His breath hitched. This was no ordinary child. The newborn's eyes fluttered open, and glowed faintly, like embers hidden under ash. Not a trick of light, not a reflection, but a true, unearthly radiance. A soft mark shimmered across the infant's skin, a sigil of light forming patterns no one could recognize, glowing faintly as though etched by the hand of the cosmos itself. The doctor holding the child swayed, his lips moving soundlessly. His eyes widened with terror, then rolled back. With a thud, he collapsed to the floor, the infant still safely cradled in his arms as a nurse rushed forward to catch both. The room erupted in gasps and shouts. Ivanov struggled to rise from the bed, his body weak but his instincts sharp. He reached out a trembling hand toward the child, and in that moment, the newborn's glowing eyes met his. The cries softened instantly, replaced by a strange calm, as though the infant recognized him. As though it had been waiting for him all along. The storm outside roared, thunder crashing directly above the hospital. The lights flickered, shadows leapt across the walls, making the sterile white room feel like a cathedral of fear and wonder. What is this?" whispered one of the younger nurses, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. Another doctor crossed himself repeatedly, muttering a prayer under his breath. "It is not human," he said hoarsely. "Or it is more than human. Dear God." Ivanov, barely able to keep himself upright, whispered the words he had been afraid to speak. "It's mine." The room fell, silent again, broken only by the steady patter of rain against the windows. None dared contradict him. The infant in the nurse's arms blinked, its glowing eyes slowly dimming until they appeared almost normal, though the faint mark of light across its chest still pulsed gently, like a second heartbeat. One by one, the staff retreated from the bedside, unable to bear the weight of the miracle, or curse, that had manifested before them. Some backed out in silence, others in trembling panic. The nurse holding the child finally placed the baby carefully into Ivanov's arms, as though guided by something beyond her own will. The hardened soldier, who had stared death in the eye without flinching, now gazed down at a fragile, glowing life. His calloused hands cradled the infant with an almost reverent gentleness. His breathing steadied, his lips moved as if trying to form words, but only silence emerged. For a moment, everything else ceased to exist. The storm outside, the unconscious doctor, the terrified whispers. There was only the soldier and the child, the warrior and the miracle. But the silence could not last. The lights above flickered once more, and a strange humming filled the air, low and resonant, as if the walls of the hospital themselves were vibrating. Papers fluttered off desks, instruments rattled against trays. The storm outside intensified, lightning striking so close that the glass panes shook violently in their frames. The infant shifted in Ivanov's arms and gave a tiny sigh, its glowing mark pulsing brighter for an instant, then dimming again. Ivanov tightened his hold protectively, glaring at the chaos around him as if daring the world itself to come for what was his. In the corridor outside, soldiers stood guard, their rifles ready but their hands shaking. None of them wanted to enter the room after hearing the strange cries and seeing the flickering lights through the glass. They had faced enemies of flesh and blood, but whatever was happening inside that room was beyond bullets and bravery. Finally, a nurse whispered the words that everyone had been too afraid to say aloud. "This child is not of this world." The phrase lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Ivanov, cradling the infant to his chest, looked down once more into those strange, luminous eyes. The storm quieted for a heartbeat, as if pausing to listen. He whispered, barely audible but with the certainty of a soldier delivering a vow. "Then the world will answer to me." The baby's glow pulsed once, faint but steady. The storm roared back into life, as though agreeing. And in that moment, the fate of Sergeant Ivanov, and perhaps far more than just him, shifted forever.